Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight what we're going to be looking at is the Magna Carta. And like all our videos on here, they are around about 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes long, so they're not going to be in-depth studies on the topics that we're covering. The aim of these, really, from when the lockdown started way back in March last year, was to have little snippets of information which would hopefully enthuse you and give you the encouragement to go out and look a little bit more. So hopefully that's what these videos are doing. And like all our YouTube videos, please let us know what you would like us to talk about in the future. Remember, we cover military and social history, and obviously because we're from Worcester, we also cover local history. So if there is anyone watching from Worcester, if you want more local history stuff, let us know. Remember, this is as much your channel as it is ours. Anyway, so we're going to talk about Magna Carta briefly, and it's an interesting subject. And once again, as we always say, Worcester is linked to everything, and we are linked to Magna Carta. We don't have a Magna Carta. We don't have, for example, anything to do specifically with the Great Charter, as it was called in English. But obviously, inside Worcester Cathedral, we do have King John. And obviously, King John is being buried in there since 1216. Now, Magna Carta was sealed in 1215. And that was after a vast amount of problems with King John. So 1215, he was called to account. He had to put his seal to Magna Carta. And then a year later, that's all really, in 1216, King John had died. And he died in a very horrible way, to be fair. Now, we don't really know what he died of. Most people will say dysentery, which was actually a scourge of most people in the Middle Ages. And saying that, if you look back, in history, a lot of people were dying of it, and it's mainly down to the fact there is no clean water. And if you look back to one of our videos about clean water, for example, you will see things like dysentery, things like cholera, and things like that were killing people. Hundreds and hundreds of people were dying every year, and it didn't just touch the lower classes, because you have to remember people came into contact even at the higher levels as well. So even the rich would have been coming in contact with water of some description. And it may have been just, for example, cups and that had been rinsed in contaminated water. It can be anything like that that will actually cause it. Now, dysentery is absolutely horrible, because obviously it causes great pains in the stomach, the griping of the guts, as it was often called, where you would be doubled over in praying to die, to be fair. And obviously it also includes vast amounts of diarrhea and vomiting. So it's quite an horrific way to die. However, poisoning can also show the same symptoms, and that's the interesting thing, because most people say King John died of dysentery, or as it was sometimes called, the bloody flux, or was he actually poisoned? And the thing is, both of them could be the truth, really. We know he died at Newark Castle, and in his will, that's still in the cathedral in Worcester, the oldest monarch's will actually in Britain, you will see in there he actually asked to be buried in Worcester. Now, he asked to be buried in Worcester for several reasons. One, he had links with Worcester. He was coming to Worcester on a regular basis. We know he spent Christmas or Christmas in Worcester several times. He hunted in the area. He was constantly moving through here anyway. And the other interesting thing is he fell in love, or followed the cult, as it was sometimes called, of St. Oswald and St. Wulstan, the two saints in Worcester Cathedral. And obviously those two saints, who were previous bishops that had actually rebuilt the cathedral in a way, when they died, because there were miracles associated with them, or people having miracles performed when they were very near to where the graves, the tombs were of those two saints, or those two bishops, they became saints. And obviously they were buried in the main part of the cathedral, in the main body of the cathedral, or priory as it was often referred to at the time. And King John, when he died, asked to be buried between those two saints, because remember, King John led an interesting life, a life full of taking land, taxing people. And remember, he was always referred to as Bad King John. If anyone remembers the stories from long ago about Robin Hood, for example, or even the films on television, it is always Bad King John. Richard the Lionheart, this great warrior king, is dead. He is no more. King John takes the throne, throws his weight around, thinks himself above the law. He is the king after all. He can do what he wants, and led a horrible life. He even murdered his nephew. He was bumping off anyone that said anything against him. And like I said, he was very fearful that in death he would not get into heaven. So that's the link. The fact that he loved St. Oswald and St. Wolstan, he needed to get into heaven, so he was asked to be buried in Worcester Cathedral. Now, that is an antiquarian drawing, actually. That's actually a drawing that was done, I think, around about the 1800s, or maybe even earlier, actually. I think 1800s, to be fair. And it shows the effigy on the top of King John's tomb. Now, it's interesting because originally, his tomb in 1216, his tomb did not look like that. It was pretty plain, to be fair. But we know by the time of Henry III, and in particular 1232, then this was the tomb top, or the effigy that was placed on top. And the interesting thing is, it is now said to be the earliest effigy of a king that actually looks like the king in life. And it's interesting because previous to this tomb, or this effigy, most monarchs would have a stylized image of the king on the tomb. For example, it would have a crown, an orb, and a scepter, whereas this is said to have the greatest likeness of the king himself. And like I said, it was pretty much funded by Henry III to be a better tomb topper than the one he had, basically. So in 1232, this one appears, and originally it would have also been painted. So the gowns, for example, would have been royal red. His skin would have been flesh coloured. His hair would have been a brown colour. And the interesting thing is, where you can see all these little circular features here, they would have held jewels as well originally. And we also know there would have been ironwork going over the top. And if you do look closely, if you get a chance to come to Worcester Cathedral in the future and see the tomb of King John, you will see dotted around are small holes which would have held iron railings or iron grills that went over the top. And they would have been gold leaf. Now, there are some very interesting things with this. For example, his eyes are open, and that was down to the fact that he didn't trust anyone. He didn't know who was lurking in the corners to kill him, because after all, he led a dangerous life. His sword is unsheathed as well, which shows that he was always ready to defend himself if need be. And people say he's actually digging his armoured feet, his spurs, into one of the lions, or leopards technically, that exists on the English coat of arms. So it's quite an interesting effigy, to be fair. It's the man himself. That is Bad King John. But these two figures at the top are in fact St. Oswald and St. Wolstan, and that's down to the fact that King John thought if the monks, for example, at the priory, at the cathedral, moved his tomb, or maybe even moved the shrines of St. Oswald and St. Wolstan, he needed to guarantee he could still stay in heaven. And the best way of doing it is making sure that later on, when this new tomb topper went on, it would have St. Oswald and St. Wolstan on the pillow next to his head. So no matter where he moves to, he will always have the two saints that he absolutely loved next to him. Now, the most important thing about King John's life, in a way, was the fact that in 1215 he was forced, in a way, and that's what he said at the time, he was forced to put his seal to a very important document known as Magna Carta. And Magna Carta, even today, is said to be one of the most important documents going. Now, I do have a picture of it, and that's it just there. And at the time, it was a complete list of grievances, is the best way, really. Now, the barons who had got fed up with King John for a very, very long time had actually put down a list of grievances, which was often referred to as the Articles of the Barons. And it was a complete list of grievances, really. And then a man called Bishop Langdon actually wrote down and put those grievances into the charter, which we now know is called Magna Carta, or Great Charter. Now, the Charter itself is not that big. It's only about 15 inches by 20 inches. And I do have a replica one here. Now, this is one that we use when we go into schools. It's one that we use for talks as well. And this had a lot of use in 2015 when we were involved in Magna Carta celebrations nationally. And as you can see, it's not that big. It's quite a small document, even though it's called the Great Charter. It's full of Latin words. There's about 4,000 Latin words on there, and they are often abbreviated Latin words as well. So it's very difficult to read. I personally cannot read it. Even if you look carefully, the wording is not the biggest, so it is a very difficult document to read. And when Magna Carta was first produced, 40 of them were produced in total, and that was because you couldn't just have one in London, for example. It had to travel around the entire country, the kingdom as it was said, so everyone would see it. Everyone would believe that this document has actually been produced. And like I said, it was a list of laws, rules that the king must now abide by. Sadly, even though there were 40 of them actually produced in its day, there is not that many left surviving. There are actually 4. There's 2 held at the British Library. There's one held at Salisbury Cathedral, and the other one is in Lincoln. So there's not many left. There's only 4, and they're very, very well looked after. Now, if you can't read Latin or abbreviated Latin, all the 4,000 words on there, luckily I do have the transcript, luckily, because that allows us to read it. And the interesting thing is that document is not bullet points. It's not a list of grievances as we would think them, and it's not in fact clauses. It's not broken down as clause 1, clause 2, clause 3, even though when you see it wrote down in books and so on, they often refer to it as clause 1 and clause 2 and so on. That's down to the fact that modern people have broken it down to make it easier to read, whereas technically Magna Carta is just a mass of words. But breaking it down, it includes things like there is to be better freedom of the church, there is to be a curtailing of the king taking land, because what you have to remember is the king often took land from whoever he wanted. If there was a knight or a baron that had good farmland, or in particular good hunting woodland, King John would just take it. So it was to reduce that, to stop that from happening. It also included taxation. Taxation would be there, as it always have been, always will be, but it would be curtailed, because you have to remember King John was just plundering the nation. There are some horrific quotes about King John. For example, one was Hull itself was defiled by King John, which is quite an interesting one. Even Hull had actually been destroyed in lowered because of King John. This is the one with relation to taxation. He was a pillager of his own people. He taxed people. Those that didn't have any coin to pay, he would take their sheep, he would take their cattle, for example. And then the other one is he feared not God or respected man. So you can really see the type of person King John was. Now, with history, we've always got to look back and think, can we review him again? Is he really that bad? Deep down, I've looked at it, and a lot of other historians have looked at it, and we can't really find much good from him, apart from the fact he did finally put his seal to Magna Carta. Now, there's only a few laws, or a few things or clauses, shall we say, that are still relevant today, to be fair. The main one is the fact that you cannot just be arrested. So today, for example, a policeman or even a person, to be fair, a citizen's arrest, no one can physically arrest you unless there is a reason for doing that arrest. And that really comes back to Magna Carta. The other one is the fact that everyone deserves a trial. So you wouldn't be thrown into prison for no reason and then end up in prison for life, for example. There is things in place now because of Magna Carta that proves that you must go through that sequence of being given what you're being arrested for example, and then finally going to trial to prove your guilt or prove your innocence, obviously. But as I keep saying, King John put his seal to Magna Carta. Now, we often think and we often say, where was Magna Carta signed? And some people say, well, at the bottom there's a little line and he signed his name on there. Actually, King John did not sign Magna Carta. There's no signature on there, to be fair. Magna Carta was actually sealed, and you find that with a lot of important documents. Seals were put to them, and that's down to the fact the king is the king at the end of the day. So here we have a copy of the wax seal that was added to Magna Carta. So it's a wax seal, a large great seal, and on the one side is King John riding on his horse into battle with his helm, his mail shirt, his surcoat, and you can just about see, hopefully, the lions upon his shield. And then on the other side is King John the king, not the warrior, but the king, sat upon his throne with his sword, for example. Yeah, so that's his great seal, and that was added to the bottom of Magna Carta, which you do see on a lot of charters, in fact. So, very briefly, in 1215, Magna Carta is sealed by King John. That takes place famously at Runnymede, but the only problem is the Barons' War takes place after. Basically, the Barons' War erupts after that, mainly because King John said he was forced to put his seal upon it. And the wars went on for some time, including the Great Siege of Rochester Castle, the Siege of Dover Castle, for example. It was an horrific time. But famously, in 1216, King John had actually died of his dysentery at Newark during a thunderstorm, it was said, and then buried in Worcester Cathedral. And famously, 1232, he gets the new effigy. The effigy displaying him as he would have looked in life, and the two saints, St. Oswald and St. Wulstan, the two people that would guarantee his access into heaven. Anyway, on that note, because we don't want to ramble on all night, this was only a brief overview to tease you a little to look further into King John and Magna Carta. So on that note, stay safe, stay in, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.